Hi, everyone. I'm Gail Persicelli, and I'll be serving as your moderator for today's ILTA webinar, Threat Automation and Incident Response for Law Firms. Our speaker today is Paul Chiazio, the co-founder and chief security architect for TruShield Security Solutions, where he develops corporate strategy and leads the company's technical product and service development efforts. I would like to thank TruShield for sponsoring today's webinar. Their sponsorship is vital in keeping our webinars free to our members. Today's presentation will run about 45 to 60 minutes, and please submit all questions to the Q&A box, and if those are not answered during the presentation, we will address them at the end. Before we start, please know that we are recording today's webinar, and we'll post a link to our website under recordings shortly after today's presentation. I'll now turn the webinar over to Paul.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, attendees. I'd also like to extend a thank you to ILTA for continuing to put together a great program of security information for our law firm partners. We're happy to be a sponsor of ILTA and happy to be able to present this information to you guys, so thank you to ILTA. I'm going to be talking today about automated threat identification and incident response and how that applies to law firms specifically. We'll delve into what technologies support this, what some common threats and statistics around those threats are that we observe within the law firm community, and then what you can take away from this is perhaps some to-dos within your own firms going forward. As Gail mentioned, I'll be happy to take questions at the end, so if you do have some, please feel free to let us know, and we'll get to those later on. So without further ado, our agenda for today, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about myself and about TruShield just to provide some frame of reference as to how we look at this problem. I'm also going to talk to you again a little bit about cyber threats specific to the legal industry and what we see throughout our own client base. Talk about some trends and statistics that will really, I think, distill down the importance of being able to automate and orchestrate to the greatest extent possible, and then what some solutions look like that can actually help solve this difficult problem. So that's me. I'm Paul Chiazio. I am the co-founder and CEO of TruShield Security Solutions. I've got about 20 years of information security experience and technical experience throughout a variety of industries, including federal government, financial, legal, and healthcare. My background largely focuses on strategic consulting at the CISO and CIO level. However, I do have quite a bit of experience with getting your hands dirty, hands-on keyboard type stuff like ethical hacking and penetration testing. So I think for me, that enables me to understand how this problem looks from the attacker's perspective, and that helps me help our clients. My contact information is up there. I do invite people to reach out to me on LinkedIn or email or on Twitter. If you have questions following the webinar, please feel free to reach out. Additionally, we do publish threat information on our LinkedIn, so if there's any information that you're interested in following with respect to threats in the legal industry, please feel free to follow us there. Real quickly about TruShield, so we are a global company based in DC. We do provide professional services and managed services to law firms. On the professional services side, we do penetration testing and risk assessments, as well as things like program building around ISO and the SANS 20 critical security controls. But more so, we perform a 24/7 managed security service for customers, wherein we do real-time automated threat detection and real-time automated incident response. And so I think that's why we were asked to participate in this webinar, because we can provide some real-world examples of how this works and kind of what works and what doesn't. So that's a little bit of background about us. So diving into the actual content of the webinar here, I think the key thing to remember is that threats and identifying threats is not a simple thing to do. There's typically a very high technical barrier to being able to identify threats within any industry. I think law firms are even perhaps more so in some regards because of the nature of the business that you guys are in. You need to interact with your corporate clients. They need to share information with you. It's typically highly confidential information. And oftentimes your attorneys are perhaps not acting in the best security interests of either the firm or their clients, but simply rather trying to get the information as quickly as possible. And that can cause some problems with respect to how you govern information and how you control access to and protect that information. That's, I think, a unique wrinkle to the law firm industry. And I've seen organizations that don't even have document management systems yet. So those of you on the phone that are listening to this thinking about, yeah, you're right, that's definitely a problem within our industry. There are probably good examples and bad examples within law firms of how to do this correctly. But one way or another, there is a high technical barrier. There are a variety of different tools that can help solve the problem of identifying threats. but usually they're very expensive. And not just expensive, they can also be very difficult to implement and integrate with all those myriad systems that you guys have to operate. So high technical barrier, and additionally, there's no panacea. Unfortunately, anybody that's telling you that there is either misinformed or is simply lying to you. There really isn't. There are so many different ways that an attacker can attempt to penetrate your environment that you need to be really broad-based in how you look at security. And that old adage of defense in depth is really true in that regard. You need to have multiple layers of security in order to be able to do this job because there simply is no silver bullet. I think that's largely because there's so much siloed data. If you look at your security ecosystem, you see a variety of different tools that all work towards the same goal, but kind of do it differently. You've got firewalls, you've got IDSs, you've got IPSs, you may have a mail gateway or a web content filter, things like that. And again, they're all working towards that larger security mission. But in many organizations, I've seen a lack of integration amongst those tools. And that siloing of that relevant security data is really to the detriment of the law firm. And anybody that's out there that's thinking, yeah, this is a reflective of the environment that I operate in, you're going to find yourself behind the 8 ball at some point and unable to really correlate the events together to draw intelligence about what's actually happening within your environment. That siloed data is one of the biggest challenges that the security industry is trying to overcome right now. It's typically through a SIEM, a security incident and event management system, security information event management system, helping to integrate these tools together. But it really, the topic that we're talking about today goes one step beyond SIEM. And it's really, we're talking about orchestration and how do we bring these tools together from an orchestration standpoint to be able to go and take automated steps when we do discover malicious actions within an environment. But one way or another, again, identifying threats is challenging. And one thing I'm also going to point out here is it's not simply a technology problem with respect to this. There's also a great deal of a skills gap and a training gap around this. And that's one thing that we're trying to coach our law firm partners and clients in from a leadership perspective, is to allocate a significant budget towards training and skill set development within the technology staff. Because there are many examples of organizations that have a high security spend, a lot of really awesome tools and a great technology capability, but they still kind of fall short of the mark because there's not adequate training in how to implement those tools, how to monitor them correctly, how to integrate them together, et cetera. And again, that's a problem that's got to be overcome quickly. And it has to be overcome quickly because, unfortunately, this is a situation where time is really of the essence. Responding to threats is so critically time sensitive that it really can't be undersold. You have to, first off, be able to identify the threat, and that's going to be very quick. You have to be able to do that usually within seconds or less than seconds if possible. And that's really where you're going to be relying upon your kind of perimeter protection tools, your firewalls, your next-gen firewalls, your IDSs, IPSs, and your SIEM, helping to correlate that data together to help you identify when there is malicious traffic on the network. But that's really just step one, and you have to then know what action to take. And that can be challenging in and of itself. There are some statistics that show that it can take sometimes weeks, sometimes months, to respond to a threat and to kind of close the holes that are open and attackers are actually using against you. So knowing what action to take, that's really where we're talking about the training and having the skills and resources to be able to take those actions. Having your staff understand your environment from a very granular level in terms of what security tools are protecting what elements of your environment, what critical information assets, what critical resources, et cetera. That skill set is incredibly important, and this is not something that you can simply just rely upon tools completely. And unfortunately, seconds do matter when we're talking about incident response. I'm going to demonstrate how seconds matter by walking you through the life of a data breach. So let's say today a data breach occurs. Within hours, 60% of the data that's going to be stolen from you is stolen within hours, 60%. Now, the problem with that is that typically, if you look at industry averages, it takes something like 7 months for a threat to actually be detected and for a data breach to actually be uncovered. And so if you think about that, if I'm able to steal 60% of the data that I'm going to get from you within a couple of hours, and you're not going to learn about that for several months thereafter, I as the attacker win. And the goal for everybody needs to be to draw that detection time down as much as possible. Largely, that's going to be through automation. But then secondarily to that, not just detecting it, but obviously closing the holes has to be done much more quickly because there's no guarantee that data breach that occurred today, another one doesn't occur tomorrow that you don't discover for another 7 months after that. And then the other startling statistic about this is that there's something like 750 million individual records on the black market, and they usually live for about 3 years. So information that is stolen from you within a couple of hours from the time of a data breach is going to exist on the internet, on the black market, being traded, being sold to the highest bidder, usually in large tranches of maybe 1 million records at a time, for potentially up to 3 years. And so that's a big problem, right? I think you guys as folks that are interested in security all recognize that this is a significant problem that needs to be shored up. But really, this is an attempt for us to crystallize the importance of rapid response and rapid containment and rapid remediation, and why it is truly an absolute imperative to automate as much as you possibly can. Relying on that skill set of your team that I talked about earlier, unfortunately, it's probably not going to be good enough. And that's not necessarily an indictment of anybody on the phone or anybody's individual skill sets, but simply a reflection of the industry at large. There's something like 1 million open cybersecurity jobs this year, and there's just a dearth of resources to fill those positions. So relying exclusively on an individual's time, bandwidth, and own knowledge to be able to respond to threats, it just doesn't work, and that's been borne out time and again. So there really is an imperative to automate, and that's something that we're going to get into now. So I wanted to give an example of what this looks like and kind of what we see happening pretty frequently within a law firm environment. An example that we see pretty often is the obvious, the phishing attack. Phishing attacks typically come in with myriad different payloads. Sometimes it's going to be a botnet client. Sometimes it could be a Trojan. Of course, I'm sure everybody on the phone is saying ransomware, which is probably one of the more common ones that we see today. But it could be as simple as a malicious attachment or something along those lines. One way or another, there's going to be several hops that malicious traffic is going to take along the way, and each of those hops is going to have some relevant security information that we can pull out and that we can then pivot to do something with. For the very high performing and very mature organizations that really have their security ecosystem kind of well planned out and well integrated, all of this stuff works in concert with one another to be able to achieve this high level of automation goal that we're working on here. So let's just start at the left here. We've got some mail traffic inbound from the internet. First off, it's going to hit your perimeter, and your firewall is going to show some event log. In this case, the example that we're working with here, the event log that is reflective of this particular piece of mail traffic shows some information. It's going to show the mail header typically, and that mail header is going to have an IP address, which is going to be the source origination point of that email. Now, there exist databases out there that if you don't have access to via a next generation firewall or via a good SIM platform, you could pay a subscription to subscribe to. Those databases contain IP reputation information, millions and millions of IP addresses that are known to participate in malicious activities such as phishing or spamming or malware delivery or botnet command and control, et cetera. And those databases are super important when it comes to this automation and orchestration component, because you need to be able to very quickly be able to make a decision as to whether or not some piece of traffic is malicious. And that one right there, that IP reputation, is typically a very good indicator. If you've got some traffic coming in from the outside from some IP address that's known for some malicious activity, that there's not any real good business justification for you guys to be having communication with them, that's the smoking gun right there, at least the red flag that something's got to happen. So anyway, again, you've got that IP reputation at the firewall. The next step that's probably going to get to is the mail gateway, and that mail gateway is going to be where you're going to be able to get a little bit more granular with the information that is going to be seen and helping you identify whether or not that's a threat. The mail gateway should, again, be able to show that there's something malicious in the email header. A lot of times this is going to be signature-based, or it's going to trip a rule within your mail gateway that says, there's something suspicious about this email, and we're going to want to flag it to do something about it. But oftentimes it's still going to deliver it on. And let's say it does get delivered to the endpoint, and unfortunately, Susie in accounting clicks the link, and then let's just say it's a malware which is going to affect some registry change that opens up some communication port to allow some backdoor into the environment, or communicates back out to a command and control node. You should hopefully have a host-based IDS tool on that endpoint, and then event log there is going to show that there was a registry key change. All that stuff that we're describing in there is going to happen within a second, usually. And in order to really be able to do this job, you've got to be able to bring those together and show that that's kind of the signature of this specific attack. If you can't do any of this stuff, or maybe if one of these things you're not as strong at as some of the others, you probably want to focus some attention towards that. I've certainly seen in law firms, very good perimeter protection, also pretty good email gateways with a lot of reliance upon some cloud-based tools and some perhaps newer mail gateway tools that are out there that are pretty effective. But oftentimes there's a lack of attention towards the endpoint. And so I see some organizations moving towards implementing HIDs or host-based IDS on their endpoints, but still is the case that many do not have that. And that host-based IDS is really a critical layer in that defense in depth strategy that I talked about earlier, because first off, it's obviously going to be able to protect the endpoint better than nothing, and certainly better than something just as simple as antivirus, but it's also going to facilitate that log forwarding capability. And so for anybody out there that runs in a Windows environment, Windows doesn't have a good native log forwarding capability built into it, so it's usually got to rely upon some other tool set, and that's where the host-based IDS often comes in. I see lots of organizations rely upon WMI to pull logs from endpoints, WMI being Windows Management Instrumentation, which is a good way to remotely retrieve logs, but incorporate some security issues in and of itself, in that it's easily abused for a malicious insider to pull information about what's going on an endpoint from the endpoint itself. So host-based IDS is typically what we'd recommend there, simply because it provides that prevention capability in that you can better lock down the device itself, but also some more detailed and granular inspection to what's going on the device itself. All that stuff's got to get pulled together into a SIM. And again, for anybody out there in the audience that hasn't implemented a SIM yet in your environment, you're probably missing things from a security standpoint that the SIM would be able to uncover for you. All this information being brought together, being correlated together in an automated incident detection sort of framework would trigger an alarm effectively instantaneously. And then your security staff would be able to actually take some response to it, even if you don't have that fully automated response capability yet from an orchestration standpoint. So those independent entities are all working together to protect your cybersecurity infrastructure and your technology infrastructure, but they've really got to be coupled with that kind of piece that glues them together. And then our recommendation is always going to be to monitor, 24/7, because the folks that are attacking us are typically not working 9 to 5. And so if you are, then again, you're probably missing some significant percentage of attacks that are actually coming through. So that's the identification component, right? So we've put all that information together, and we know that there's an event going on in the environment right now. What do we do about it then? So we've alerted on it. Now what, right? So now what is where the orchestration stuff actually happens. So if you see here, what we did is overlaid what the remediation or response action would be upon these same icons. So again, I'm going to start from the outside and work my way in. So that mail traffic is still the same, but the firewall, your orchestration tool can add a block for that malicious IP address. So it simply will drop traffic from that IP going forward. And that's a pretty good way to ensure that you're not going to be attacked by that malicious IP address anymore. But the problem that raises, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is that these malicious IP databases contain millions and millions and millions of IP addresses. And so adding a block rule for each individual malicious IP can sometimes be challenging. And it can usually be very cumbersome for a technology staff to be able to do that. Most organizations really don't have somebody that can be on the firewall all day adding IP blocks for malicious IP addresses. So some orchestration there certainly helps solve this problem. The mail gateway as well, there's some orchestration that can be done there to help block future attacks that match that signature that basically we created on the fly when we observed that initial attack that was on the previous screen. So, wrap around, some parameters that indicate describe that particular mail that we identified as malicious, and then add that to the signature database so that if something comes through matching that again, it's automatically going to be blocked. Again, that's going to solve a recurrence of that specific threat. But as we know, the attackers are pretty sophisticated, and changing just some small aspect of an attack may make that signature no longer valid. So this is something, again, where relying upon either an individual to create signatures or taking that reactive approach is probably not going to do the job completely, and really have to be looking at orchestration and automation in order to do this correctly. And then the host-based IDS component of it. So I mentioned earlier that, I really think HIDS is probably not an accurate nomenclature for that because there are some prevention capabilities built into these tools. So it's really more of a HIPS than a HIDS. And a lot of times they can be configured to block registry changes. They should be if they can. If they can't, at least what they can often do is roll back registry changes to a known good. And usually that can be done via a central management console. So that you can either manually, an individual can take that action, or again, if there's good security orchestration in place and this automated response capability exists, then you can take that action a little bit more proactively versus simply reacting to it. But again, what we're seeing here is multiple different security tools that all have to be kind of tied together. And from a detection standpoint, that tying together is the SIM. From a response standpoint, the tying together is really that orchestration tool set. And there are several out there from a security orchestration tool set that actually will do this for you. We're typically a vendor agnostic company in terms of tool recommendations, but there are some out there that are good, that we know work, that we incorporate into our own platform. I can get into those a little bit later. But one way or another, similarly to how a SIM ties together the detection component, the security orchestration will tie together the response component. The one thing I do want to say, though, is that it's really a flawed approach to rely exclusively upon tools in this regard. I mentioned earlier on that why it's difficult or why it's challenging to identify threats, that there's multiple different facets to the problem. Facet 1 being a high technology barrier, facet 2 being a lack of skill sets, and facet 3 being that time really is of the essence. So if you rely exclusively on tools, you're leaving out one of those facets, and that's the human aspect and the ability for a human to be able to perform things like continuous monitoring and kind of plug the holes that our imperfect technology can't really do. So if you look at kind of both sides of the house, obviously humans are going to be imperfect in solving the security challenge in and of themselves, but really ultimately the tools are also going to be imperfect in solving these problems utterly in a vacuum, and the two really need to work together. So it's it's somewhat cliched to use this, but it truly is a people, process, and tools sort of a problem or approach to solving this problem. And unfortunately, I'm going to air some dirty laundry here. This is all publicly available information, but there are some real-world examples within the law firm community of aspects where data breaches have resulted in significant reputation loss. And a lot of times, and I can't comment on any of these specifically, but there are some very widely known data breaches wherein people were relying exclusively on automation and exclusively on their tool set to help them identify threats, and then wound up still somewhat behind the 8 ball because the indicators were in their tools, but nobody actually noticed or took action based upon the indicators that they failed to observe. And that, I think, is kind of the absolute worst case scenario, because in those cases you have an organization that's done the right thing in terms of implementing a high degree of security tools and a good security ecosystem, and has done all of that hard work of integrating the tools together so that the indicators would appear within their security tool set, but then they failed to couple that with the monitoring component to really help them identify rapidly and take rapid action to contain and eradicate threats. And so you spent a lot of money, but you still didn't get the value out of that. And that's something that we always try to harp on with our clients. This really is truly not just a technology problem, because there are so many idiosyncrasies, probably within each of these law firms and within each of your own law firms, about information flows, about workflows between different groups, about access controls to sensitive document stores, things like that, it's not really possible to automate all of that logic. And that's where someone with a high degree of institutional knowledge needs to come into place to understand, when something is suspicious enough to warrant a reaction. And again, unfortunately, many times the tool sets in and of themselves can't do that. So our perspective on this is that really you have to balance that automation with that continuous vigilance, with that 24/7 capability. And that's something that I think, again, I see law firms trending towards that direction, but it's still something that most have to put some effort towards. So that's my content for today. Do we have questions with respect to what we covered?
Yes, we do. First of all, Paul, thank you for the content. Okay, everyone, if you would utilize the Q&A box for any questions for Paul. While we're waiting for the questions, I'd like to mention that a link to the recording of the webinar will be posted on our website in a few days. And you will also be receiving a survey to evaluate today's webinar. We ask you to take a few minutes to complete that, and this will help us develop more quality educational opportunities. Okay. Yes, I do have some questions. The first one, if someone wanted to start implement a cybersecurity plan like this, what are the first steps they should take?
Yeah, I get that question all the time. I think that's the right way to look at this is, what's the first step? And so to me, when I'm asked that, I first off say, well, do you know where you're at right now? Are you able to say, where your weaknesses are? And if you're not, then that's really got to be the first step. So performing a current state assessment of your current capability set, where your tool strengths and weaknesses are, not just tools, but again, process and people and technology, and where those weaknesses exist, and then try to prioritize them so that you can kind of build a roadmap to implement technologies that will first off shore up those individual layers of that defense in depth strategy, and then work to integrate all that together. So a little bit more on that. What we typically recommend a law firm to do that's identified that they want to move the security program forward, but kind of don't know where to start. A lot of people ask us about ISO and ISO 27001. We hear that all the time from the law firm community. And a lot of times, unfortunately, and this is again not an indictment of anybody's security program, but ISO is it can be very prescriptive. It's obviously a very good framework, but it's somewhat daunting to implement. And if you're focused on that from going from 0 to ISO certified, that's a significant challenge to undertake. So what I would typically recommend an organization do if they're really just starting on this and trying to get feel for where they're at and where their weaknesses are, start with the SANS 20 critical security controls, because that's a very technically focused reference framework. And with that, you can assess how well you're doing across those 20 different controls. And for anybody not familiar with it, the 20 critical security controls is a framework that was developed by an industry consortium, including members of the CIA, NSA, intelligence community, federal government, financial industry, healthcare industry, et cetera, very high confidentiality sort of environments. And they put together this framework of what are the 20 most important things an organization should be doing from a security standpoint. And that's a great place to start. And so if you can assess yourself against the SANS 20 critical security controls, what it will do is it'll help you build that kind of maturity model of what your security ecosystem looks like, and help you then pivot to building a roadmap as to where you need to shore up the capabilities to be able to integrate stuff together. The SIM and the orchestration stuff that I mentioned should be a goal for everybody. But truly, that's if you're looking at against the SANS 20 critical security control, there are three maturity models or layers within the SANS 20, and you start with kind of the quick wins, the hygiene and maintenance, and then the advanced capabilities. And that SIM and orchestration is more on the advanced side. So if you still have, as you observe your own ecosystem, you still have quick wins that you have to implement, or you're not quite good at doing the cyber hygiene stuff, you don't have good configuration baselines, for instance, then the orchestration stuff's probably a couple of steps away from where you're at right now. So you really do need to have these foundational layers in place before you can start thinking about how do we take that next step to put automation in place to really help us get to that next level of capability. So start with an assessment of where you're at right now, and then work towards building that kind of maturity model and the roadmap that will take you. Sometimes we write 30-day roadmaps because people are very close to the finish line. Sometimes it's 36 months. So it depends upon where you're at, but it'll at least give you a path to follow. And then the other thing that'll do is it'll help you highlight to management where focus needs to be from a budgetary perspective, and kind of what to expect from a budgetary perspective to get them where they need to be.
Okay, I have another question that came in from Andrew. Do you have any recommendation thoughts on implementing DLP within law firms?
Sure. Yeah, DLP is a hard one within law firms. And the reason because there's usually so many different types of data that a law firm processes, and usually your document management system, it processes many different types of data. The first thing with any DLP implementation, and for anybody who's not familiar with the initials in there, it's data loss prevention, is to understand where the data is and what the data is. You've got to be able to do that data classification effort. First and foremost, you have to know what sort of information you're processing and where it's stored. And I think why that's challenging in law firms is because information governance is something that is not really well implemented within a lot of law firms that I've observed. So by that, what I mean is, you might have a good document management system that you use to store, matter information or case information, things like that. But, you may have some attorneys that in their attempt to just get information from their clients quickly, have a client drop stuff up on Dropbox and they pull it down from there. Or they have documents stored on their own laptops and not within, a document repository. And if you have an environment like that, then DLP is going to be effectively impossible to implement correctly. So first and foremost, you've got to get that information governance problem solved, and it's got to start with policy, and it's got to start from the very top of the organization, from managing partners, et cetera, putting forth this a firm stance on how matter information and client information is managed within the environment. And if you can control that so that it's only existing within your document management system or within a file repository that's well access controlled, then DLP becomes something that's much more within the frame. And you can write the rules around different types of data so that you can observe when it's leaving via your email system or via a connection out to a Dropbox, for instance. One thing that we do recommend law firms try to work towards, and I know this is going to be very controversial within the firms on the phone, is to move away from the cloud-based document sharing systems like Dropbox and Box. I know that's probably impossible to implement from where you're sitting right now, but truly there's so little control over information flowing into and out of those tools within your environment that it's it's like a bucket with a giant hole in it. You're simply not going to be able to plug it, and you're not going to know what information is traveling there, without blocking it if you possibly can. Other things that you should be considering blocking, if possible, are personal email addresses and things like cloud-based email systems like Gmail or Yahoo Mail, et cetera. I know, again, these are controversial things to bring forward within your law firms, but if the firm's truly interested in securing its client data, then they're going to want to do the stuff that I described. And I know for a fact that there are law firms that have blocked things that I just mentioned, like Box and Dropbox and Gmail, et cetera. There was significant resistance from the attorneys within those firms, but eventually, by management championing the importance of it, it was something that moved forward. And then again, once you get your the data stores under control, you can implement the DLP on top of that. One thing again with DLP and any security tool is that it's got to be integrated with the rest of the security system, the security ecosystem. It's not something that can really be a standalone in a vacuum sort of tool set. You've got to be pulling logs from your DLP system into your SIM, correlating that against things like those malicious IPs that I mentioned earlier, and then that'll help you kind of better control data within the environment. But first and foremost, perform that data classification exercise and understand where your information exists and what it is you're doing with it.
Okay, I have another question from one of our members. What vendors would you recommend?
Okay, vendors, I'm going to assume that's probably for the orchestration question. So as I mentioned, we're typically somewhat vendor agnostic. We're not a reseller of anybody's tools or anything like that, but I can tell you what it is that we use, and I can give you some other recommendations in terms of tools that we've observed work pretty well from an orchestration standpoint. One caveat to this is that some of these are very expensive, some of these are much less expensive, and I'm going to give you at least one that is an open source tool. So, depending upon your budget appetite and what sort of spend you want to allocate towards something like this, then you have a couple different options. Ncase is what we use for orchestration, and works pretty well for us in terms of being able to integrate with a wide variety of different security tools to help us perform rapid remediation, things like that. That's not an inexpensive tool, and so an individual law firm may struggle to allocate budget for something along those lines. I will say that there are ways to kind of realize some economies of scale by working with an MSSP around this sort of thing, but Ncase is the tool that we use. Proofpoint's another one that's got a pretty cool security orchestration tool set. There's an automated response capability built into that, and if any of you guys are using Proofpoint for Mail Gateway or things along those lines, it's a very good integration with that. FireEye obviously has some very good tools with respect to sandboxing for mail and web traffic, and that's a tool that we use as well to help protect our clients. Again, that's another one that's somewhat expensive depending upon your security appetite and your budget. You may not be able to implement it. So the tool that I wanted to mention that's open source that does some of this stuff is called Fido. And this was released last year. And interestingly, I think this tool is interesting because it was developed by people at Netflix who had a massive problem to solve with a gigantic infrastructure and many thousands of nodes within the environment that needed to be kind of controlled from a singular interface. And they developed a tool to do it themselves. And I guess in a rare moment of corporate altruism, released the open source code to the world to be able to use within your own environment. So obviously the caveats that go along with open source tools are that they're typically harder to integrate. There's typically going to be less access to something like a vendor support channel, but there's usually community support. Might be a little bit more challenging to customize to your own environment, but that's a tool that also works. From a threat detection standpoint, so the automated detection, obviously there's many different tools out there from a SIM standpoint. Being an MSSP, we operate our own technology inside the environment, but there are a couple different technologies that we use to support that. Splunk is one of them. Alien Vault is another. Those are both pretty good tools to help with the correlation component of it. The other aspect of it, again, is that you have to have access to those threat databases. And so threat databases, there are many out there. Some of them are very expensive. Some of them are open source. We try to balance between the paid subscriptions and the open source. For people that are just simply looking to get a threat feed at little or no cost, there's something called the Open Threat Exchange, OTX, which is a really good resource for people. If you don't have any capability currently, that's a good place to start.
Okay, the last question we have, what kind of common threats are you seeing law firms struggling with lately in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, I think there's many. The one that we see probably most commonly in the law firm space is ransomware right now. And I think that's, hopefully there's not too many people on the phone that have been hit by it, but I know that when I've given talks at, trade shows and things like that, I have people come up to me afterwards, and it's usually something like 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 are willing to, perhaps after a beer or two, admit that they have been crypto locked. Most people don't want to admit that that's happened, but that's probably the most rampant thing out there right now. And I think that's probably because it's relatively easy to pull off, and there's a direct path to money for the attacker. And even if you look at the recommendations like the FBI has given, if you don't have good backups or good prevention and that kind of forethought to protect yourself from it, you don't have many options but to pay the ransom. And so it's easy for the attacker to monetize. So that's probably the most common one that we see. And I think there's a good couple reasons for that. First off, that defense in depth strategy that I talked about earlier, a lot of law firms have most of those things that I described, but there are still many that don't have all of them. In fact, probably few that do have all of them and really have that full security ecosystem fully locked down, all the way down to the endpoint. And that endpoint is really where the ransomware is going to make itself, most manifest. And the ability for, and in fact, actually the example that I gave in the slide deck earlier speaks to this point. So what will often happen, that piece of ransomware, the sophisticated ones today, they don't rely upon a call home. So a lot of times malware, when it gets dropped within an environment, will beacon back out to a command and control node somewhere out on the internet that the bad guy's in charge of, and it will basically say, I'm here, I'm ready for commands, please tell me what to do next. And that traffic is something that is easy to pick up. If you can identify traffic outbound to a malicious IP address that's known for command and control, that's again a smoking gun. You got to do something about it right now. But current modern ransomware, it's not even really relying upon the call home anymore. It's simply got logic built into it that says, lay dormant for some period of time and then execute. And then they'll start automatically encrypting files. Usually that will come with a registry key change. And if there are a couple of things within the endpoint system that are not done correctly, it can spread pretty quickly. One thing that we recommend law firms do is to make sure that applications downloaded from the internet that are downloaded to user space on the endpoint cannot execute with administrative privileges. So certainly you don't want to have your users with admin privileges on their desktops, and that's been common guidance or best practice guidance for a very long time, but still not unfortunately implemented everywhere. So if somebody were to accidentally download some ransomware payload and it lands in their user space and executes under their context, if they're an administrator, then it could very quickly spread to every device that endpoint has access to. Additionally, a lot of the ransomware attachments that are coming in as attachments are doing so via macro-enabled documents, so like Excel documents or Word documents. And so your mail gateways should be configured to block macro-enabled attachments from automatically executing. Unfortunately, that's still not like a default configuration. Proofpoint, for instance, you have to go and manually configure that. Office 365 is the same way. So make sure that that's done, and that's going to help you protect yourself, but we see that pretty frequently. So I'd say ransomware is probably the most common. Maybe second most common would be an exploit kit like Angler. Angler being a tool set that includes multiple different capabilities, so that effectively a payload gets dropped, and then again, like I mentioned earlier, it beacons back out to a command and control node, and then there are multiple different exploit capabilities that payload has. So the individual on the attacker side, what they do is actually rent out access to the malware on your endpoint, and then whoever rents it can decide what they want to do with it, and whether that's gain direct login access to your environment or steal PII off of the endpoint or anything like that. That's probably the second most common thing. We see that in law firms and in the financial industry pretty frequently.
Okay, well, that wraps up our webinar. First of all, thank you, Paul and TruShield for sponsoring the webinar. I appreciate that. And everyone that attended, look on our website for the recording in a few days, and we look forward to seeing you on future webinars. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ilta. Thank you, Gail.